Hello, I'm Arlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Israel keeps dropping tons of bombs on Gaza. It wants to replenish its stock. Western military contractors are eyeing big profits. Also this week, more American weapons are being delivered to Israel. How far will the US go with military aid to the nation? And Israel's major offshore gas field is shut. Could geopolitical tensions threaten the nation's ambitions to grow its gas exports? Russia's invasion of Ukraine spurred a global rush to buy military equipment last year. Defense spending across the world hit more than $2 trillion. That is the highest level since at least the end of the Cold War. That's according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Now, the surge in arms sales has boosted the bottom lines of defense giants. Military contractors and investors are now all eyeing an explosion in financial returns as the war on Gaza drives up demand for arms in Israel. Shares in Lockheed, RTX, Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics have all risen sharply since Hamas's attack on Israel on October the 7th. Now, while the aerospace and weapons sector as a whole has seen an increase of 7% in value, this is, of course, as thousands of people have been killed in Gaza, entire neighborhoods flattened, and even hospitals attacked during Israel's military offensive on the Strip. The UN warns war crimes may have been committed by both sides of the conflict. Well, military contractors discussed how the war could be good for their business during their company earnings calls. That's according to a report published by The Guardian newspaper and the Responsible Statecraft think tank. General Dynamics Executive Vice President of Technologies and Chief Financial Officer Jason Akan was quoted saying the following: "You know, the Israel situation obviously is a terrible one, frankly, and one that's just evolving as we speak. But I think if you look at the incremental demand potential coming out of that, the biggest one to highlight, and that really sticks out, is probably on the artillery side." Meanwhile, the Biden administration is set to deliver hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel. And US defense companies are ramping up production to meet the increase in demand. Military contractors' direct sales to clients represent a major portion of the global arms trade. US arms manufacturers' commercial sales abroad, authorized by the Pentagon, reached nearly $154 billion last year. Well, joining us now from London is Andrew Feinstein. He's the Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations, also the author of the book, The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade. Many thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost. So we have seen this surge in demand for defense companies, defense shares. Is that something you see that will continue for a while?
Oh, absolutely. These companies and their share prices obviously thrive on conflicts, especially the sort of conflict that we're seeing in Palestine at the moment, where there is a constant need for new equipment, particularly what we call ordnance, so missiles and bombs. Because as Israel drops bombs on Gaza, they need to replenish that stock immediately. So that is a huge boon to these companies. So you'll see a company like Lockheed Martin has seen an increase of 18% in its share price over the past month since the 7th of October. And
is it US companies, US contractors mainly who are benefiting from this, or is this European manufacturers and UK manufacturers as well?
So the prime beneficiary is obviously the United States, what is sometimes referred to as the military-industrial complex or the defense companies in the US. The US supplies anywhere between 70 and 90% of all of Israel's military hardware that it imports from outside of Israel itself. But Britain, Germany, Italy in particular follow fairly close behind for the remainder of that. So companies like BAE Systems, ThyssenKrupp, Leonardo, would benefit alongside the Lockheed Martins, the Northrop Grummans, the Raytheons, or RTX, as it's now called, and General Dynamics. So it's a combination of American companies and European weapons makers.
As we heard me mention earlier, I mean, we've heard how some defense companies have been criticized for framing the Israel-Gaza conflict as good for their bottom lines. But they are in the business of selling weapons, aren't they? So it's not a surprise that war is good for business.
Well, no, it's not. But it raises a whole range of questions about the morality of this business. I mean, how I describe the business in my book is a business that counts its profits in the billions, but its losses are actually counted in human lives. So I don't think the fact that war and conflict is good for their business should necessarily allow us to say that, you know, when Raytheon or RTX CEO Greg Hayes says, as he did just the other day, the fresh new contracts resulting from Israel's bombardment of Gaza would mean that across our entire portfolio, we're going to see a benefit of this restocking. Now, this doesn't let them off the hook. And in fact, it's even arguable that they might have a case to answer for in terms of possible complicity in violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes.
When it comes to the US, I believe US defense contractors need approval from the US government to sell weapons overseas. So does that moral decision then fall on the US?
Well, in some senses, but the reality of arms export controls in the US and in European countries in the United Kingdom is that these controls, while they exist on paper in theory, are barely utilized in practice. So, for instance, the United Kingdom a few years ago issued what it calls an open license for export to Israel. So we don't actually know the quantum of military equipment that Britain has exported to Israel, because this license allows companies like BAE Systems and others to export as much as they want to Israel without any sort of authorization. The same has just happened in the United States, where they're talking about this massive new $106 billion authorization to a number of what it would describe as friendly or allied countries. But in the case of Israel, with that $106 billion, almost $4 billion of that doesn't require any authorization at all. So the moral impetus lies both with lawmakers and the executive members of government, who are effectively giving themselves free rein to export as much as they want to Israel, but also with the companies. And yes, it's good for company business, but because you're going to get an enhanced return for shareholders doesn't in any way negate the moral compromises of what your business is and what it's contributing to in Gaza at the moment.
We now have two big ongoing conflicts, the war in Ukraine and, of course, the Israel-Gaza war. Is there enough out there? Is there enough weapons out there to meet the demand caused by these conflicts?
Sadly, there is. There is more than enough weaponry that is produced in the world, 40% of it produced by the United States itself. There is more than enough weaponry to go around in all of these conflicts. And we shouldn't forget that what the situation in Gaza does is it also makes other conflict-prone areas, like Yemen, for instance, in a much more febrile position. So it is quite possible that the insecurity, the instability that we are seeing in Palestine could actually have impact on Yemen, where there has been both a formal and informal ceasefire in place for a while. But the sad reality is that there is more than enough military materiel or equipment to go around for the conflicts that are taking place and for any others that might arise.
Andrew Feinstein, really good to get your thoughts. Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations. Thank you.
Thanks.
Meanwhile, Belgian transport workers' unions called on their workers to refuse handling arms shipments for Israel. They said loading or offloading weapons would mean supplying organizations that kill innocent people. The union cited a genocide is underway in Palestine, while workers have seen arms shipments going in the direction of the war. Now, Israel says it is targeting Hamas and not civilians in Gaza. Protesters supporting Palestinians blocked a US military ship allegedly carrying weapons for Israel at the port of Tacoma in Washington. Israel has received nearly $130 billion in US security assistance since its creation in 1948. That's more than any other country in the world. Now, as the war in Gaza intensifies, more American weapons, including smart bombs and interceptors for the Iron Dome missile defense system, are being delivered to Israel. President Joe Biden has vowed to keep supplying the nation with what it needs to boost its defenses. Democrats and Republicans broadly agree on military aid to Israel, but both parties have attached conditions to the bill. Heidi Jo Castro reports from Washington, D.C.
With just a handful of members voicing any qualms about sending more U.S. military aid to Israel, the question isn't whether the U.S. Congress will approve the Israeli aid, but rather how and when.
This is not about party or politics. It's about the security of our world, the security of the United States of America.
President Joe Biden wants Congress to send $14 billion to Israel, and as part of the same legislative package, $60 billion to Ukraine. But polls show public support for Ukraine among Americans is falling, with conservative voters in particular expressing concerns about a growing U.S. government deficit.
We want to protect and help and assist our friend Israel, but we have to keep our own house in order as well.
The Republican-controlled House took on the aid proposal first, removing the money for Ukraine and insisting the money for Israel be offset by budget cuts to the Internal Revenue Service. That's despite warnings the measure would reduce tax collection and, ironically, increase the deficit.
So, the House GOP proposal is not going anywhere. It's dead before it even is voted on.
Democrats control the Senate and support keeping aid for Israel and Ukraine together in one package. And in a rare sign of bipartisanship, most Senate Republicans agree, a break from their party members in the House.
Everybody knows how strongly I feel about helping Ukraine and Israel.
Like Israel, Ukraine was the victim of an unprovoked attack by a repeat violent offender.
The U.S. currently sends $3.8 billion a year to Israel. It's sent $124 billion since Israel's founding. Now the Senate is drawing up its own bill that puts money for Israel and Ukraine together in one package, which is sure to tee up a showdown with the House version, one that will have to be resolved before any money leaves the country. Heidi Jo Castro for Counting the Cost, Washington.
Joining us now from New York is Colin Clark. He's the Director of Research at the Soufan Group, which is a global intelligence and security consultancy, and a non-resident senior fellow in the National Security Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you for joining the program. I think it may surprise some to learn that Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign assistance since the 1940s, with most of that money spent on military support. Why have the U.S. been giving Israel so much cash, a small, rich country, and for so long?
Well, it doesn't surprise me or most of the people in my circle. I mean, it's a common topic of discussion. Israel, Egypt as well, receiving large amounts of U.S. foreign assistance. A lot of it dates back to the relationship with the U.S. Being one of Israel's primary backers, and throughout the U.S. political system, very strong links between Israel and the United States as one of Washington's closest allies for a very long time.
And is there bipartisan support for this military aid within Congress? Because there were some hurdles recently with the latest aid package.
By and large, there seems to be bipartisan support, probably more so for Israel at this point than for Ukraine, as that conflict continues to drag on.
Why is that? Why is that?
I think it's fatigue. Excuse me. I think it's fatigue that the conflict has been going on for as long. People were expecting different results. I think there was a lot of optimism that the Ukrainians would defeat the Russians, and now we're it's the bright, shiny object. We're on to the new issue, and people are paying attention to this until this gets old. It's really the kind of ebb and flow I guess, the amount of attention that the U.S. public can pay to a specific issue at one time.
There are some polls that suggest that there are some Democrats, albeit in the minority, who are not supportive of this military aid to Israel. Do you see at some point their numbers increase?
Very likely over time, especially as we continue to see civilian deaths. I mean, the numbers are staggering. The images are horrifying. And so the longer this goes on, frankly, I think the more revulsion there will be at the really high lethality count. And there will be growing calls for ceasefire, for humanitarian pause, and for diplomatic pressure to bring an end to the conflict.
Does the U.S. administration give this military aid to Israel unconditionally, or are there caveats attached, for example, protecting the rights of innocent civilians?
Well, I don't think any aid is ever unconditional, even if there are fewer strings attached to military aid to Israel. It's always something that any U.S. administration is going to be looking at. The U.S. has continuously attempted to pressure the Israelis to mine civilian casualties. It's just you're talking about fighting in a dense urban environment, which makes that incredibly difficult. And I think again, these images that are coming out are having a real impact globally, but also on the U.S. population domestically. And as we see that, we see rising protests and demonstrations, including on college campuses, calling for the administration to really try to press harder for a ceasefire.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think we are seeing finally a moment where ordinary Americans, even politicians, are finally starting to question this aid that has been going to military aid that's been going to Israel for so many years?
I really hope so. I think, it makes sense to take a step back and take stock of where the United States is sending money and what that money is being used for. We saw this a couple of years ago with U.S. military aid and weaponry that was being sent to the Saudis, that was being used in the Yemen conflict, right? And just some of the, again, devastating images coming out of Yemen, pressure building on the administration to pull back and pull back support to that conflict, to the warring sides in that conflict. So there's always going to be a reassessment, but I would also caution not to overestimate the U.S. public's interest in foreign policy, because issues that tend to decide elections are domestic largely. And so I think there's a fleeting interest at the moment, and that likely breaks down along demographic lines. I think the younger generation tends to be far more passionate than some older generations, and just look at the polling for proof of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick you up on that. The fact that Americans, when it comes to voting, are affected by domestic issues. I guess the issue would be if this ends up costing their bottom line. I mean, there's been some concern, isn't there, that in order to pay for this, it's people on the ground that may have to pay for it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think if you look around the country, there's a lot of areas within the United States where people are suffering. They're, out of work, food insecure. And so there's a lot of questions of people saying, why are we sending all this money overseas when we have so much work to do here at home? And I think, look, that's a fair question, right? And that's something that should be part of the political debate. There was the third Republican debate in Miami, and these are issues that need to be asked to politicians, right, who are running for political office. Why is this happening? Yeah.
Very good to talk to you. Colin Clark, Director of the Research at the Sufan Group. Thank you.
Thank you.
Israel is a significant gas producer and exporter to countries in the Middle East. The nation was aiming to expand its export routes to Europe after the halt of Russian supplies. But production at Israel's second largest offshore field was suspended on October the 9th after Hamas launched its attack on the country. Rising geopolitical tensions could hurt investments in the wider region and threaten Israel's plans to grow its exports. Now, according to a report by the consulting firm BDO Israel, the nation's gas exports have dropped by 70% since it shut down the Tamar field. That is worth more than $200 million a month. Well, the field supplies the Israeli market and delivers gas to Jordan as well as Egypt, which provides gas exports all the way to Europe. Natural gas fields off the Israeli coast account for nearly 70% of its power generation. Israel is now seeking alternative fuel sources in order to meet its needs. I'm joined now from our studio in Doha by Ahmed Halal. He's a practice director of the MENA region of the Global Council. Thank you for your time, sir. So, according to these figures by the accountancy firm BDO, Israel's exports of natural gas has dropped by 70%. That sounds like a lot.
Definitely. I mean, gas exports from Israel have plummeted by 70%. And the worst affected by this is its nearest neighbors, its biggest customers as of today, Egypt and Jordan. The original volumes reaching Egypt now are 30% of the volumes that were reaching Egypt pre-war. And Egypt itself was the export platform and the export infrastructure in Egypt, the liquefaction terminals there. Israel depended on those to then re-export its gas to Europe. So those exports are therefore affected as well. Less Israeli gas is reaching international markets, and internationally, this will create a bit of a squeeze. But with that said, we shouldn't overstate the role of Israeli gas in supplying international markets, because it only accounts for less than 0.5% of international gas supply, as compared, for instance, to a place like Qatar, where we're sitting today, which accounts for 20% of global natural gas supply.
But in terms of Israel's own needs, is it going to have to find alternative gas to fill the gap?
Well, for Israel is fortunate in the sense that Tamar isn't its only active gas field. Its larger gas field, also off the southern coast of Israel, the Leviathan, a much bigger field, also operated by the U.S. major Chevron, can continue to supply and continue to step up. Other fields like Karish will continue to step up and meet Israel's power generation needs. So its energy security risks remain contained. But if the shutdown of Tamar does become a prolonged situation, then it will have to begin thinking about procuring gas internationally from other suppliers.
You talked about Egypt and Jordan. To what extent are they going to be affected?
Well, respectively, Egypt and Jordan imported 7% and 4% of their total gas supply from Egypt. So after the attacks, those exports to Egypt ground to a complete halt. They are incrementally back now, but Egypt is, I would say, the worst affected. And it has been since the summer, when it had an unseasonably hot summer, and weakened domestic production meant that Egypt was introducing rolling blackouts and has serious energy security situation on its hands because of this interruption of supply from Israel. So Egypt is now having to buy, from becoming a net exporter of natural gas, is having to buy LNG tankers and LNG supply from international markets.
And what about Europe? Because they were already seeing an issue in terms of Russia and receiving gas from Russia, and they were looking for an alternative supply, and they turned to Israel. Now, will they still be able to fill that gap that Israel was filling?
I think they will, because Israel was a marginal supplier of gas to Europe. After the Europeans calibrated the response to the Russian shutoff of gas by diversifying their export base. So they went to Qatar and are now signing, and other countries in the US, and signing long-term supply deals. So I think they've diversified enough to be able to weather this shock. Now, the war has caused a surge in European gas prices, in the Dutch forward, the Dutch benchmark that's looked at in order to gauge what's happening in the gas markets. They're 30% higher than October the 6th, but that's not just because of what's happening in Israel and Gaza. It's what's happening in Australia with LNG industrial action over there, and a shutoff in a Baltic region pipeline. So it's a multipolarity of factors that's causing supply to be squeezed. It's not just Israel.
OK, that was really good to get your perspective. Ahmed Halal, Practice Director of the MENA region at the Global Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Marlene Saeed. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Of course, you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. News on Al Jazeera coming up next.